The Machine Mind. Lin Carter brings to dubious reality one Harvey Hodges, a simple, ordinary person with a simple, ordinary character who enjoyed an unexciting and unglamorous life, until he found out that he possessed the power to Weebelfetz. Creates the machine mind which had replaced the councils of men, ruling them now according to the covenant and for the ultimate good. And now, for the ultimate good, it has decided to completely replace man. Conjures up the gods of Neom Parma, who must demote one god to mortal man in order to obtain needed first-hand information, but the original quest is forgotten as the question becomes, is it more fun to be a man or a god? So my daughter tells me she's learned a new card game from her friends. The game is called BS. I'm not sure what the letters stand for. The object of the game is to empty one's hand of cards. As the game proceeds through a sequence of conditions, ace, 2, 3, and so on, players take turns discarding cards that match the condition. They can discard cards that don't actually match the condition by bluffing. Other players can call the bluff. If they're right, then the player whose bluff was called must take all of the cards from the discard pile. If the player who called the bluff was wrong, though, then that player must take all of the cards. The game proceeds through rounds until somebody's hand is empty. I'm sure most people have played this game or variations on it. The reason I'm talking about BS is because the students at my daughter's school have become obsessed with the game, and as a result, the game has evolved. Or it's probably more accurate to say that the students have evolved. I suppose I don't need to remind anyone that we've been living through the blurring for several months now, or longer. No one's really sure how long anymore. All we know is that strange things happen. I've been recording what I've seen and heard in these videos, like this game. It all started when one of the 9th grade boys showed up to school with a deck of cards and a glint in his eye. He's in the 9th grade, but about the size of a 6th grader, and he acts much younger than his age. His voice hasn't changed, and he seems sweet or innocent, although he can swear a blue streak when he's angry, which happens when he's picked on. His name is Ben. "I'm a giant," he says, and he yells, "Fee, fi, fo, fum." He started the game at lunchtime with a couple of friends, and pretty soon other groups of kids were playing the game. The teachers were surprised by the sudden popularity of the game, but in a high school there are all kinds of fads that sweep through like prairie fires. I learned about the game because my daughter taught me to play. I'd guess this was about 2 or 3 weeks into the fad. She had to remind me of the rules, but they weren't exactly how I remembered them. She told me you couldn't just call a bluff, you had to call out what the discarded cards actually were. I asked how I was supposed to do that, and so she showed me. We played a few hands. I played my hand truthfully up until 5. I didn't have any 5, so I tried to discard a jack instead. She looked at me kind of carefully as I was discarding. She kind of cocked her head to one side and narrowed her eyes. Then she said, "Nope, it's a king. No, wait, it's the boy king, Jack." And then she smiled. Of course, I was amazed, but I wasn't exactly concerned. It was obvious to me that my daughter wasn't just guessing, because even though she got some calls wrong as we played, she got far too many right. And I could also see she wasn't counting cards or somehow reading my facial expression. She said she was just trying to see them, like in her mind's eye. She told me that she was playing the game, just like everyone else, and some people were better at it, some worse. So that's when I started to think that the kids at my daughter's school were actually somehow developing ESP skills. I imagined those experiments in college psychology departments during the 60s and 70s using Zener cards. You know, those cards with the wavy lines and circles and so on that were used to test for extrasensory perception. Anyway, I made a note to self to check in with her teacher, Mr. Anson, but then I was distracted by several things that came up at work, and I didn't have time to circle back for about a week, at which point it was too late. The game progressed rapidly. As I mentioned, the kids were obsessed. They played before school, at lunch, and after school. They barely had time for their phones. Their guesses grew increasingly accurate. But of course they weren't guessing. they were actually somehow seeing the cards clairvoyantly. In response, some kids started trying to, project distractions. So, for example, if they were discarding a jack, they'd visualize a 5 instead. This changed the nature of the game. Instead of a bluffing game or a perceiving game or a clairvoyance game, it became a struggle of minds. One kid would struggle to assert a mental image which another kid would seek to uncover. The kids stopped even looking at their cards. They didn't need the cards because they proceeded to a kind of mental wrestling, the object of which was becoming less and less clear. I became aware of the problem on a Tuesday morning because of the dark rings around my daughter's eyes and the pallor of her skin. I asked her what was wrong. When she spoke, her speech was thick, her intonation dull. She said she had won a tough game on Monday. A game? But what kind of game could do this? I drove her to school. I planned to speak to Mr. Anson and the principal. The school was chaotic. Outside, there were a dozen or so kids running in circles and screaming. A couple of kids had fallen on the ground. A few were crawling, and at least one of the kids wasn't moving. We went inside. There were kids sitting against the walls, holding their heads, rocking back and forth. One kid was standing in the middle of the hall, her eyes closed, intoning seemingly random words in a voice that did not seem as though it could come from her. Calinthia, Garfish, Pithecanthropus, Garfish, Pithecanthropus, and so on. I think she was studiously maintaining her absence from the game. We proceeded to the cafeteria where the game was usually played. There were at least another dozen kids with their heads down at the tables. I don't know if they were unconscious or concentrating. There was one rather small child walking around, except he wasn't walking. It looked more like he was stomping, like he was a giant. I noticed his head immediately. It was abnormal, alien-looking, huge. It pulsed. It changed color. For an instant, I could see, I think, what he was projecting from his mind. Sheer power. Sheer power. But I saw it as a muscular man, a giant. I heard my daughter say, "They must have tried to gang up on him," before I passed out. I'm here today presenting this video because my daughter saved me. Actually, she and her friends saved the whole school. She teamed up with any classmates left standing. There were a few, including one of her best friends, Sachio. I don't know many details of the battle, if that's what I should call it. Actually, my daughter tells me there was no way anyone could have beaten Ben in an outright battle. He was just too strong. Instead, she and her friends stopped Ben, or really the giant he had become, by becoming themselves a field of fluttering butterflies. Because not even a giant can win a fight with butterflies. It was tough, though, because little Ben was so angry and so certain he was stomping across a barren, smoking landscape in a battle royale fighting against monsters like himself. They did it by tickling the air, by shooting color from their eyes and sighing like a breeze. They did it by tickling the air, by shooting color from their eyes and sighing like a breeze. He started to see them as butterflies. He was so cute, my daughter says, jumping up and down trying to catch us. Or anyway, that's about all I know. It seems that nobody was harmed permanently. Little Ben's head is even back to normal. What's weird now is that the kids don't seem to have their powers anymore. Nobody's sure why, including the psychologists from Greenwood College who have been helping with the kids. The whole thing would have been marked down as mass hysteria in a previous era. I suppose this is what mass hysteria looks like during the blurring. On the bright side, Ben seems to be growing up. Seemingly overnight his voice has deepened and he seems at least a couple of inches taller, but he's still sweet. I'm a giant. I'm a giant. Fee, fi, fo, fum. I'm a giant. I'm a giant. I'm a giant. Fee, fi, fo, fum.